Two peers, one sits in marketing, one sits in sales, they're at the VP level and they're fighting with each other. Why is this? What's happening? Here's the thing. Most people want to be helpful and good. Most people. It's well over 80%. So that's good. And it's the good news for you in running your team is that you have a lot of good people. So it's not that other people are trying to be evil and they're trying to pick fights with you, but it can feel that way. It can feel like an us versus them. So if it feels like an us versus them on your team, let's find out who is the enemy that they're fighting against, right? And why is that? Now, what I find happens a lot of times is if a team is not competing outside, so they're not competing against their competitors, and instead they're infighting within their own team, that's usually, it's kind of a step along the road, but it's not a great sign of the culture, right?
This is the Being Coachable podcast with your host, Jill Chappie. Get ready to challenge your assumptions, expand your thinking, and walk away with concrete steps to help you level up your leadership, business acumen, and personal growth. It's time to get coachable.
Hello and welcome. This is episode 8 of the Being Coachable podcast. And my name is Jill Chappie. I've been an executive coach for over 20 years in mostly corporate environments, Silicon Valley technology companies. And I'm here today to talk to you about us versus them. So what is the us and what is the them? Well, what I've discovered in my many years of coaching with technology companies is, and this is true, I think, in all companies, it's not just technology companies, but what I've discovered is that there's this phenomenon of us versus them. Now, us versus them shows up in a couple of different ways, but I'm going to cover two of the main ones. And the first one is management versus team members or employees. And sometimes that management is senior management or executives or whatever it may be versus the rest of the company. Sometimes it can be the CEO versus the rest of the company. Sometimes it can be peers versus each other. It can be all kinds of different manifestations of us versus them. It can also be cliques or groups that form together in teams. And when they form together in teams, then they have an us and they have a them, right? So even within let's say a marketing team that has, the brand and creative team is opposed to the product marketing team. So that's the us versus them. But I want to talk about two things specifically, which are maybe most relatable to you. And what I mean by that is you might have an us versus them situation with your boss or manager. So this is what I want to cover first. So I have found that when an executive is working on a particular area, so let's take a head of product. An executive in that area, a head of product could be, VP, SVP, whatever it may be. And that person is trying to get something done in the product arena. So in that product arena, they're working on the product. They're very creative about the product. They have this team rolling. They might have multiple teams. The teams might be global, etc. They end up with an us versus them against, let's say, the CEO, for example. So I've known many CEOs who have a lot of product knowledge. Some of them even have engineering backgrounds. And so, they're used to developing products and they have quite a status of being an opinion leader on product in general. So now this head of product is trying to get something done and they run into the fact that the CEO is not necessarily on board with the way that they're doing product. So, for example, sometimes the CEO may override their statements about how products should go, might override the strategy or might set the strategy themselves. So now why is this an us versus them? It doesn't have to be that way, by the way. Sometimes it isn't, but I do see occasionally this problem of where the CEO runs into this issue with any of his executives and it feels like they're in a tug of war. So it feels more like a combative situation than it does like a friendly or we're on the same team situation. So I want to point this out because there are actually 3 ways you can play the game of business. And then I'll get into one of these other us versus them situations. But there are 3 ways you can play the game of business, more or less. There's probably a few more, but this kind of gives you the general picture of it. The first way you can play the game of business is you can have infighting within your own team. So let's say you own a product marketing team and your team members just fight with each other all the time. They don't have any agreement on direction or strategy, and they just are constantly bickering. This is what we call infighting. It is a game. People show up to work for it. Sometimes it's gossipy, it's negative. And if you have a negative culture in your team, you might have a lot or some of this. Okay, so that's kind of game number one. Then there's game number two, which is to play the game in battling with divisions. So this is kind of what I was just describing. You might have a CEO battling with the head of product, or you might have the head of product battling with the head of sales. You could have the head of marketing upset with the head of sales. Sometimes we see this in marketing and sales. They kind of go head to head like, hey, that lead was mine, or I developed that pipeline. And then the sales team says, no, that pipeline was ours. And hey, how are we getting paid on this? And how are we doing our metrics on this, et cetera, et cetera. So we can get a lot of these battles that occur in business. So this is game number two. Now there's game number three, though, which is a little bit more functional. And I want to talk about what game number three is, because the purpose of going over this with you is that I want you to understand what game you're playing and then how to win it. So if you know what game is happening in your company or in your team, then you have a better chance of winning, right? So if one person's playing Scrabble and another one's playing Monopoly, they're not necessarily on the same page. And so then the person who's playing Scrabble isn't going to win at Monopoly. So let's know what game we're playing. And hopefully you're playing game number three, which is competition against the marketplace or competitors out in the market. Now, it's kind of rare that I find that people are playing game number three, where they're actually competing with people outside the building, or we'll call it their virtual building, the walls of whatever is encompassed by the logo they work for, right? So, if you work for Microsoft, Microsoft isn't only one building, it's many buildings, and it's all across the world. And you may work in any one of those teams in any one of those locations, but you're under the umbrella of Microsoft or Facebook or Meta or whatever you want to call it. Whatever your business is that you're working in, you should be under that umbrella, not competing with each other, but instead competing outside. Now, why do people get into the situation where they're fighting with people in their own companies? It's interesting, right? You think, why is the head of marketing fighting with the head of sales? Or even, two peers, one sits in marketing, one sits in sales, they're at the VP level and they're fighting with each other. Why is this? What's happening? Here's the thing. Most people want to be helpful and good. Most people. It's well over 80%. So that's good. And it's the good news for you in running your team is that you have a lot of good people. So it's not that other people are trying to be evil and they're trying to pick fights with you, but it can feel that way. It can feel like an us versus them. So if it feels like an us versus them on your team, let's find out who is the enemy that they're fighting against, right? And why is that? Now, what I find happens a lot of times is if a team is not competing outside, so they're not competing against their competitors, and instead they're infighting within their own team, that's usually, it's kind of a step along the road, but it's not a great sign of the culture, right? It's an us versus them culture, and it's not a great sign that things are going well yet. So they might feel they're losing. They might feel they're not getting what they want out of their job. They're not being successful. So usually when we have a winning team, that winning team definitely feels like they're fighting against their competitors, and even they're winning at least most of the time, but maybe not all, but at least most of the time against their competitors. That's what we want. If a team feels like it's losing, they'll fight with each other. And that can be either game one or game two, where they're literally fighting with their own team members inside that team or fighting with other divisions, as in sales versus marketing. So either one of those is a little bit dysfunctional, and that's where we find this problem of the wrong game. Okay, so when we've got that, when we've got an us versus them, I want to talk about it in a second way it can manifest, which is in your teams. So let's say you've got a team and you're running this team and you used to be a part of it, but now you're managing it. This happens for a lot of people. They get elevated and they climb the corporate ladder and they become the manager of a team that once was a set of their peers. So now it can become an us versus them in terms of, this person, they feel like they're higher than me or they can guide and direct me, etc. And I want to bring up a key point here too, which is that people who are newer to management sometimes struggle with that guiding, controlling, and directing of other people. So that's where that gets into an us versus them too. And it's usually because they feel bad about it. Hey, I wasn't directing this person before we had this great relationship. I never really asked them to do things, or required them to do things or gave them deadlines, etc. Now I'm in a different situation. I'm in a different role. I have to ask them to do things, and they don't necessarily always want to do those things. So, and then we get all the emotion and the reactions that happen with when you ask somebody to do something. They just tend to get emotional about it, especially if they feel like they can't do it. So if we really boil this down, how do you get an us versus them? It's about, does the person feel like they're winning, and does the person feel like they can accomplish the thing that they were asked to do? So if you are managing a team, or if you're an executive who has a team member and you feel like this person has become your enemy, you really want to find out what it is that they're trying to accomplish, and do they feel they can accomplish that thing? Do they feel they can win at that thing? Because when a person feels like they're winning, they're not going to fight with you.
Are you hitting a wall as a leader? Do you need an outside perspective to gain clarity and direction? Jill Chappie has over 20 years of experience as an executive coach, helping leaders get unstuck and achieve their goals. She offers straight talk combined with empathy and humor to challenge your assumptions, expand your thinking, reveal your blind spots, and equip you with concrete action steps. If you're ready to level up your leadership and get coachable, click on Leadership Assessment at becoachable.com and then email to schedule your readout. Cost is $99 to get your results. Invest in yourself and your growth. You'll walk away feeling informed, empowered, and ready to implement change. Let's get coachable.
So now I have to make a caveat on this. It's a small caveat, but the caveat is that not everybody wants to win. I do cover this in an upcoming course on the 3 types of team members, but there are some team members who are just literally there to destroy your team. You've probably heard them called the cancer, or there are other names. Somebody that you don't want on your team. So if you're managing a team and you find that you have one of these people on your team and they're constantly fighting against you and there's nothing you can do about it, well, that's a whole different HR type situation where you've got to get that person at least sidelined, if not off your team. But that is not the majority of the time, because most of the time people know if there's a cancer in the organization, they don't hire that person, they get them off the team, etc. Not always, but it's most of the time. So we can assume that most people on your team want to win. So you want to get in touch with them and say, hey, are you winning? Do you feel like you're winning? Do you know how to win? Do you know what winning looks like? The easy question is, what does success look like here? What does it look like for you? What does it look like on our team? So that you have the ability to talk to the person about what success is for them, and then come to an agreement about what success is for the both of you. And then that's where you get that opportunity to come to that game that you want to be playing, which is we're on the same side and we're competing against our competitors who are outside the walls or the umbrella of our company. Of course, these days, many people are on distributed teams, meaning they're spread out all around the world through different time zones. So I want to talk specifically about how you handle this team phenomenon of us versus them with global teams. So what happens a lot of times is that certain locations get ignored. And especially if your company's US based and you have locations that exist in Asia or in Europe, like EMEA, those teams tend to get a little bit left out of the mix. Now, why is that? Well, a company that's based in the US is going to be a little bit US centric. That's the way of the world. But besides that, I think what happens is because those time zones are so incredibly difficult for people who are in North America, especially if let's say you've got a West Coast team, a West Coast based company, and that West Coast based company, so they sit in the Pacific time zone, it's a really long journey to a time zone that sits in, let's say, even Eastern Europe, let alone something like India, right? We really are almost talking opposite ends of the clock. So it's easy to have those team members left out of discussions because it's almost all asynchronous communication. They're never going to be joining for your team meeting. If they do, they join at midnight. I've actually had this happen recently. I was doing offsites with some teams, wonderful teams, by the way, wonderful people, but all the creative people sat in India and the rest of the people sat in somewhere in the US, and they had gathered together in the US in the Pacific time zone. So as we were doing the offsite, we did the best we could to schedule it at a reasonable time, but it ended up being, 10 p.m. to 2 in the morning for this other person or these other people in India. So it's just a real challenge, in terms of getting on the same page and feeling like a part of the team. So now you say, okay, well, how do I get the us versus them scenario out of the picture when I've got a distributed team like that? Well, it's not necessarily easy, but it can be done. So what this person did as we were doing this offsite was she was a female marketing leader, and she did a great job of being very inclusive of the people in India. The tough part was it was late at night for them, but she said, send in your pre-work ahead. We'll go over it for you. We can cover your part in the offsite, and then included them in the conversation up until about midnight, as much as possible. So we put them on the front end, tried to make it as time zone friendly as possible for them. And of course, this is only something you do once a quarter or max, max once a quarter, maybe once a year even. And so that allowed them to, okay, I'm going to make a special exception, in my schedule and be up at this time of the day. So that allowed them to come together as a team and not have it be an us versus them. Because when you know a person, you tend not to be an enemy with them, right? So seeing their face, talking to them, and especially if in this case, they had done some pre-work that was about themselves. And so they shared some information about themselves and, what they were good at, particularly around the work atmosphere. And it was very helpful for them to get to know each other. So I do recommend, of course, if you can do an offsite. And then I had another team leader who she did this with her team. She split them into two for the offsite specifically, but she did the East Coast and Europe, and then she did the West Coast and Asia, and did those two different offsites. But then she filmed them, she recorded them for each side, and then they swapped recordings so that everybody got to the whole team. But you see what it takes, the effort that it takes to really form up as a team. Now, this is to pull together your team. Now, how do you make sure you don't have an us versus them with another division in your own company? Interesting. Sometimes it takes the heads of those two divisions coming together, really having a conversation, maybe doing an offsite together with the two teams. If you have a problem area in your business, I would recommend that, because it's the increased communication that removes the us versus them barrier. But just remember, most of the time, when a team gets into a conflict with another team in the same company, it's because they feel like they're not winning, or they're not helping, or they're not together progressing towards the goals that they want to be progressing towards. So that's what you address, is what's the barrier that we both face? So you come together and you create teamwork around what's the barrier we both have as teams. So it makes it a kind of a common enemy. Instead of the enemy being each other, the enemy is out there. It's a common enemy in the outside or the exterior. That's what you want. And then a plan for how you can overcome that barrier or that problem together so that you can be a team together. The ultimate wonderful utopian situation is you never have infighting within your own company, and you have instead teams that work together to best the competition. So imagine you have your marketing team, you have your sales team, they're on the same page and they're besting the competition. Their competitive analysis is amazing. They share that information freely. They work together to overcome any challenges that they may have in the market. So that would be the ideal situation. So if you have an us versus them situation on your team, address this point about, does the person or the group of people who are in this argument or this conflict or this, it can sometimes be a silent war. If you have people in that situation, ask them, do they feel like they're winning? What is it that they feel like they're not winning in or against? And how can you help them to overcome that barrier? And then get them working together to achieve that. So those are some examples of where you can get an us versus them situation in your business or in your team. I hope this has been helpful for you. This has been episode 8 of the Being Coachable podcast. Again, my name's Jill Chappie. You can follow me on LinkedIn. You can join Coachability on LinkedIn. You can also go to my website, which is becoachable.com, becoachable.com, and you can find me there for more information on all of my upcoming courses and offerings. So thank you for being here today and viewing my podcast, and look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thanks for tuning in to the Being Coachable podcast. I hope you found value in today's conversation. If you have any follow-up questions or want to continue the discussion, visit our website at becoachable.com and click on Contact. Join our mailing list to receive offers for reduced-cost leadership assessments and team-building sessions. You can also find show notes, past episode transcripts, and more resources on the podcast tab. I'll catch you on the next episode as we continue to maximize our potential and get coachable.